Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now, and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Just let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume, and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to the slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. Because I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get on with tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. If you find Sleepy Time Tales useful and it helps you to get a restful night, and you would like to help me keep it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, and if you have the means to help out, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can get you fun bonuses based on your contribution level. From as little as $2 a month, you get weekly access to early release on the main episodes, so that you get your fresh sleep aid on a Wednesday instead of a Sunday, and $5 a month gets you weekly bonus minisodes, which are currently a series of poetry readings, special edits of the main show, and a monthly megasode, which is all of the previous month's releases in one big listen. And if monthly seems like a big ask, you can make once-off tips to the tip jar on the website. I have spoken recently that I've been struggling to keep Sleepy Time Tales going because it does take a fair amount of work, and the sort of financial results haven't been entirely worthwhile. So I would like to thank the people who have stepped up in the last couple of months, signed up on the Patreon, and been very generous in the tip jar. And it has helped me get to the point where it is worth me keeping it going. So I'm grateful to everybody for that. I would, however, like to spend more time on the show, do more with it, and go further from where we are. It was always kind of my dream to be able to do this full time and release 2 or more episodes a week. And I need your help to be able to get to that point. So if you can help out, please still consider supporting and help us get to even further. And you can hear me more often than once a week if that sounds appealing. Anyway, enough of that. Let's get on with the story. We return this week to Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions by Charles Mackay. The value of shares in the Louisiana or Mississippi stock had fallen very rapidly, and few indeed were found to believe the tales that had once been told of the immense wealth of that region. A last effort was therefore tried to restore the public confidence in the Mississippi project. For this purpose, a general conscription of all the poor wretches in Paris was made by order of government. Upwards of 6,000 of the very refuse of the population were impressed, as if in time of war, and were provided with clothes and tools to be embarked for New Orleans, to work in the gold mines alleged to abound there. They were paraded day after day through the streets, with their picks and shovels, and then sent off in small detachments to the outports to be shipped for America. 2/3 of them never reached their destination, but dispersed themselves over the country, sold their tools for what they could get, and returned to their old course of life. In less than 3 weeks afterwards, 1/2 of them were to be found again in Paris. The maneuver, however, caused a trifling advance in Mississippi stock. Many persons of superabundant gullibility believed that operations had begun in earnest in the new Golconda, and that gold and silver ingots would again be found in France. In a constitutional monarchy, some surer means would have been found for the restoration of public credit. In England, at a subsequent period, when a similar delusion had brought on similar distress, how different were the repairs taken to repair the evil. But in France, unfortunately, the remedy was left to the authors of the mischief. The arbitrary will of the regent, which endeavoured to extricate the country, only plunged it deeper into the mire. All payments were ordered to be made in paper, and between the 1st of February and the end of May, notes were fabricated to the amount of upwards of 1,500 millions of livres, or 60 million pounds sterling. But the alarm once sounded, no art could make the people feel the slightest confidence in paper, which was not exchangeable into metal. Monsieur Lambert, the president of the Parliament of Paris, told the regent to his face that he would rather have 100,000 livres in gold or silver than 5 million in the notes of his bank. When such was the general feeling, the superabundant issues of paper, but increased by evil, by rendering still more enormous the disparity between the amounts of specie and notes in circulation. Coin, which it was the object of the regent to depreciate, rose in value on every fresh attempt to diminish it. In February, it was judged advisable that the Royal Bank should be incorporated with the Company of the Indies. An edict to the effect was published and registered by the Parliament. The state remained the guarantee of the notes of the bank, and no more were to be issued without an order in council. All the profits of the bank, since the time it had been taken out of law's hands and made a national institution, were given over by the regent to the Company of the Indies. This measure had the effect of raising for a short time the value of the Louisiana and other shares of the company, but it failed in placing public credit on any permanent basis. A council of state was held in the beginning of May, at which Law, D'Argenson, his colleague in the administration of the finances, and all the ministers were present. It was then computed that the total amount of notes in circulation was 2,600 millions of livres, while the coin in the country was not quite equal to half that amount. It was evident to the majority of the council that some plan must be adopted to equalize the currency. Some proposed that the notes should be reduced to the value of the specie, while others proposed that a nominal value of the specie should be raised till it was on an equality with the paper. Law is said to have opposed both these projects, but failing in suggesting any other, it was agreed that the notes should be depreciated 1/2. On the 21st of May, an edict was accordingly issued, by which it was decreed that the shares of the Company of the Indies and the notes of the bank should gradually diminish in value till at the end of a year they should only pass current for 1/2 of their nominal worth. The Parliament refused to register the edict. The greatest outcry was excited, and the state of the country became so alarming that as the only means of preserving tranquillity, the Council of the Regency was obliged to stultify its own proceedings by publishing within 7 days another edict, restoring the notes to their original value. On the same day, the 27th of May, the bank stopped payment in specie. Law and D'Argenson were both dismissed from the ministry. The weak, vacillating, and cowardly regent threw the blame of all the mischief upon Law, who, upon presenting himself at the Palais Royal, was refused admittance. At nightfall, however, he was sent for, and admitted into the palace by a secret door. When the regent endeavoured to console him and made all manner of excuses for the severity with which in public he had been compelled to treat him. So capricious was his conduct that 2 days afterwards he took him publicly to the opera, where he sat in the royal box alongside of the regent, who treated him with marked consideration in face of all the people. But such was the hatred against law that the experiment had well nigh proved fatal to him. The mob assailed his carriage with stones just as he was entering his own door, and if the coachman had not made a sudden jerk into the courtyard, and the domestics closed the gate immediately, he would, in all probability, have been dragged out and torn to pieces. On the following day, his wife and daughter were also assailed by the mob as they were returning in their carriage from the races. When the regent was informed of these occurrences, he sent Law a strong detachment of Swiss guards, who was stationed night and day in the court of his residence. The public indignation at last increased so much that Law, finding his own house, even with this guard insecure, took refuge in the Palais Royal and the apartments of the regent. The Chancellor, d'Argesau, who had been dismissed in 1718 for his opposition to the projects of Law, was now recalled to aid in the restoration of credit. The regent acknowledged too late that he had treated with unjustifiable harshness and mistrust one of the ablest and perhaps the sole honest public man of that corrupt period. He had retired ever since his disgrace to his country house at Frayne, where in the midst of severe but delightful philosophic studies, he had forgotten the intrigues of an unworthy court. Law himself, and the Chevalier de Conflans, a gentleman of the regent's household, were dispatched in a post-chaise with orders to bring the ex-chancellor to Paris along with them. D'Argesau consented to render what assistance he could, contrary to the advice of his friends, who did not approve that he should accept any recall to the office of which Law was the bearer. On his arrival in Paris, 5 councillors of the Parliament were admitted to confer with the Commissary of Finance, and on the 1st of June an order was published, abolishing the law which made it criminal to amass coin to the amount of more than 500 livres. Everyone was permitted to have as much specie as he pleased. In order that the banknotes might be withdrawn, 25 million of the new notes were created, on the security of the revenues of the city of Paris, at 2.5%. The banknotes withdrawn were publicly burned in front of the Hôtel de Ville. The new notes were principally of the value of 10 livres each, and on the 10th of June the bank was reopened, with a sufficiency of silver coin to give in change for them. These measures were productive of considerable advantage. All the population of Paris hastened to the bank to get coin for their small notes, and silver becoming scarce, they were paid in copper. Very few complained that this was too heavy, although poor fellows might be continually seen toiling and sweating along the streets, laden with more than they could comfortably carry, in the shape of change for 50 livres. The crowds around the bank were so great that hardly a day passed that someone was not pressed to death. On the 9th of July the multitude was so dense and clamorous that the guards stationed at the entrance of the Mazarin gates closed the gate and refused to admit any more. The crowd became incensed and flung stones through the railings upon the soldiers. The latter, incensed in their turn, threatened to fire upon the people. At that instant, one of them was hit by a stone, and taking up his piece, he fired into the crowd. It was every instant expected that a general attack would have been commenced upon the bank, but the gates of the Mazarin Gardens being open to the crowd, who saw a whole troop of soldiers with their bayonets fixed, ready to receive them. They contented themselves by giving vent to their indignation and groans and hisses. Eight days afterwards, the concourse of people was so tremendous that 15 persons were squeezed to death at the doors of the bank. The people were so indignant that they took 3 of the bodies on stretchers before them, and proceeded, to the number of 7 or 8,000, to the gardens of the Palais Royal, where they might show the regent the misfortunes that he and Law had brought upon the country. Law's coachman, who was sitting on the box of his master's carriage in the courtyard of the palace, happened to have more zeal than discretion, and not liking that the mob should abuse his master, he said, loud enough to be overheard by several persons, that they were all blackguards and deserved to be hanged. The mob immediately set upon him, and thinking that Law was in the carriage, broke it to pieces. The imprudent coachman narrowly escaped with his life. No further mischief was done, a body of troops making their appearance. The crowd quietly dispersed after an assurance had been given by the regent that the 3 bodies they had brought to show him would be decently buried at his own expense. The Parliament was sitting at the time of this uproar, and the President took upon himself to go out and see what was the matter. On his return, he informed the councillors that Law's carriage had been broken by the mob. All the members rose simultaneously and expressed their joy by a loud shout, while one man, more zealous in his hatred than the rest, exclaimed, "And Law himself, is he torn to pieces?" The Duchess of Orleans gives a different version of the story, but whichever be the true one, the manifestation of such feeling in a legislative assembly was not very creditable. Much undoubtedly depended on the credit of the Company of the Indies, which was answerable for so great a sum to the nation. It was, therefore, suggested in the Council of the Ministry that any privileges which could be granted to enable it to fulfill its engagements would be productive of the best results. With this end in view, it was proposed that the exclusive privilege of all maritime commerce should be secured to it, and an edict to the effect was published. But it was unfortunately forgotten that by such a measure all the merchants of the country would be ruined. The idea of such an immense privilege was generally scouted by the nation, and petition on petition was presented to the Parliament that they would refuse to register the decree. They refused accordingly, and the regent, remarking that they did nothing but fan the flame of sedition, exiled them to Blois. At the intercession of D'Aguesseau, the place of banishment was changed to Pontoise, and thither accordingly the councillors repaired, determined to set the regent at defiance. They made every arrangement for rendering their temporary exile as agreeable as possible. The President gave the most elegant suppers, to which he invited all the gayest and wittiest company of Paris. Every night there was a concert and a ball for the ladies. The usually grave and solemn judges and councillors joined in cards and other diversions, leading for several weeks a life of one of the most extravagant pleasure, for no other purpose than to show the regent of how little consequence they deemed their banishment, and when they willed it, they could make Pontoise a pleasanter residence than Paris. Of all the nations in the world, the French are the most renowned for singing over their grievances. Of that country it has been remarked with some truth that in its whole history may be traced in songs. When Law, by the utter failure of his best laid plans, rendered himself obnoxious, satire of course seized hold upon him. And while caricatures of his person appeared in all the shops, the streets resounded with songs, in which neither he nor the regent was spared. Many of the songs were far from decent, and one of them in particular counselled the application of all his notes to the most ignoble use to which paper can be applied. Among the caricatures that were abundantly published, and that showed as plainly as graver matters that the nation had awakened to a sense of its folly, was one, a facsimile of which is preserved in the Memoirs de la Regence. It was thus described by its author, the goddess of shares. In her triumphal car, driven by the goddess of folly. Those who are drawing the car are impersonations of the Mississippi with his wooden leg, the South Sea, the Bank of England, the Company of the West of Senegal, and of various assurances. Lest the car should not roll fast enough, the agents of these companies, known by their long foxtails and their cunning looks, turn around the spokes of the wheels, upon which are marked the names of the several stocks, and their value, sometimes high and sometimes low, according to the turns of the wheel. Upon the ground of the merchandise, day books and ledgers of legitimate commerce, crushed under the chariot of folly. Behind is an immense crowd of persons of all ages, sexes, and conditions, clamouring after fortune, and fighting with each other to get a portion of the shares which she distributes so bountifully among them. In the cloud sits a demon blowing bubbles of soap, which are also the objects of the admiration and cupidity of the crowd, who jump upon one another's backs to reach them ere they burst. Right in the pathway of the car and blocking up the passage stands a large building, with 3 doors, through one of which it must pass if it proceeds further, and all the crowd along with it. Over the first door the words Hospital de Foix, over the second, Hospital de Malade, and over the third, Hospital de Go. Other caricatures presented Law sitting in a large cauldron, boiling over the flames of popular madness, surrounded by an impetuous multitude who were pouring all their gold and silver into it, and receiving gladly in exchange the bits of paper which he distributed among them by handsful. While this excitement lasted, Law took good care not to expose himself unguarded in the streets. Shut up in the apartments of the regent, he was secure from all attack, and whenever he ventured abroad it was either incognito, or in one of the royal carriages with a powerful escort. An amusing anecdote is recorded of the detestation in which he was held by the people, and the ill treatment he would have met had he fallen into their hands. A gentleman of the name of Bourcel was passing in his carriage down the Rue Saint-Antoine, when his further progress was stayed by a hackney coach that had blocked up the road. Monsieur Bourcel's servant called impatiently to the hackney coachman to get out of the way, and on his refusal struck him a blow in the face. A crowd was soon drawn together by the disturbance, and Monsieur Bourcel got out of the carriage to restore order. The hackney coachman, imagining that he had now another assailant, bethought him of an expedient to rid himself of both, and called out as loudly as he was able, "Help, help, murder, murder! Here are Law and his servant going to kill me, help, help!" At this cry the people came out of their shops, armed with sticks and other weapons, while the mob gathered stones to inflict summary vengeance upon the supposed financier. Happily for Monsieur Bourcel and his servant, the door of the church of the Jesuits stood wide open, and seeing the fearful odds against them, they rushed towards it with all speed. They reached the altar, pursued by the people, and would have been ill-treated even there, if finding the door open leading to the sacristy, they had not sprang through, and closed it after them. The mob were then persuaded to leave the church by the alarmed and indignant priests, and finding Monsieur Bourcel's carriage still in the streets, they vented their ill will against it, and did considerable damage. The 25 million secured on the municipal revenues of the city of Paris, bearing so low an interest as 2.5%, were not very popular among the large holders of Mississippi stock. The conversion of the securities was therefore a work of considerable difficulty, for many preferred to retain the falling paper of Law's company, in the hope that a favourable turn might take place. On the 15th of August, with a view to hasten the conversion, an edict was passed, declaring that all notes for sums between 1,000 and 10,000 livres should not pass current, except for the purchase of annuities and bank accounts, or for the payment of instalments still due on shares of the company. In October, following another edict was passed, depriving these notes of all value whatever after the month of November next ensuing. The management of the mint, the farming of the revenue, and all the other advantages and privileges of the India or Mississippi Company were taken from them, and they were reduced to a mere private company. This was the death blow to the whole system, which had now got into the hands of its enemies. Law had lost all influence in the Council of Finance, and the company, being despoiled of all its immunities, could no longer hold out the shadow of a prospect of being able to fulfill its engagements. All those suspected of illegal profits of the time of the public delusion was at its height, were sought out and immersed in heavy fines. It was previously ordered that a list of the original proprietors should be made out, and that such persons as still retained their shares should place them in deposit with the company, and that those who had neglected to complete the shares for which they had put down their names should now purchase them of the company at the rate of 1,350 livres for each share of 500 livres. Rather than submit to pay this enormous sum for stock which was actually at a discount, the shareholders packed up all their portable effects and endeavoured to find a refuge in foreign countries. Orders were immediately issued to the authorities at the ports and frontiers to apprehend all travellers who sought to leave the kingdom and keep them in custody, until it was ascertained whether they had any plate or jewellery with them, or were concerned in the late stock jobbing. Against such few as escaped, the punishment of death was recorded, while the most arbitrary proceedings were instituted against those who remained. Law himself, in a moment of despair, determined to leave a country where his life was no longer secure. He at first only demanded permission to retire from Paris to one of his country seats, a permission which the regent cheerfully granted. The latter was much affected at the unhappy turn affairs had taken, but his faith continued unmoved in the truth and efficacy of Law's financial system. His eyes were opened to his own errors, and during the few remaining years of his life, he constantly longed for an opportunity of again establishing the system upon a securer basis. At Law's last interview with the prince, he is reported to have said, "I confess that I have committed many faults. I have committed them because I am a man, and all men are liable to error. But I declare to you most solemnly that none of them proceeded from wicked or dishonest motives, and that nothing of the kind will be found in the whole course of my conduct." 2 or 3 days after his departure, the regent sent him a very kind letter, permitting him to leave the kingdom whenever he pleased, and stating that he had ordered his passports to be made ready. He at the same time offered him any sum of money he might require. Law respectfully declined the money and set out for Brussels, in a post-chaise belonging to Madame Dupree, the mistress of the Duke of Bourbon, escorted by 6 horse guards. From thence he proceeded to Venice, where he remained for some months, the object of the greatest curiosity to the people, who believed him to be the possessor of enormous wealth. No opinion, however, could be more erroneous. With more generosity than could have been expected from a man who, during the greatest part of his life, had been a professed gambler, he had refused to enrich himself at the expense of a ruined nation. During the height of the popular frenzy for Mississippi stock, he had never doubted of the final success of his projects in making France the richest and most powerful nation of earth. He invested all his gains in the purchase of landed property in France, a sure proof of his own belief in the stability of his schemes. He had ordered no plate or jewelry and sent no money, like the dishonest jobbers, to foreign countries. His all, with the exception of one diamond, worth about £5,000 or £6,000 sterling, was invested in the French soil, and when he left that country, he left it almost a beggar. This fact alone ought to rescue his memory from the charge of knavery, so often and so unjustly brought against him. As soon as his departure was known, all his estates and his valuable library were confiscated. Among the rest, an annuity of 200,000 livres, £8,000 sterling, on the lives of his wife and children, which had been purchased for 5,000,000 livres, was forfeited, notwithstanding that a special edict drawn up for the purpose in the days of his prosperity had expressly declared that it should never be confiscated for any cause whatever. Great discontent existed among the people that Law had been suffered to escape. The mob in the Parliament would have been pleased to have seen him hanged. The few who had not suffered by the commercial revolution rejoiced that the quack had left the country. But all those, and they were by far the most numerous class, whose fortunes were implicated, regretted that his intimate knowledge of the distress of the country, and of the causes that had led to it, had not been rendered more available in discovering a remedy. At a meeting of the Council of Finance and the General Council of the Regency, documents were laid upon the table, from which it appeared that the amount of notes in circulation were 2,700 million. The Regent was again called upon to explain how it happened that there was a discrepancy between the dates at which these issues were made and those of the edicts by which they were authorized. He might have safely taken the whole blame upon himself, but he preferred that an absent man should bear a share of it, and therefore stated that Law, upon his own authority, had issued 1,200 millions of notes at different times, and that he, the Regent, seeing that the thing had been irrevocably done, had screened Law by antedating the decrees of the Council, which authorized the augmentation. It would have been more to his credit if he had told the whole truth while he was about it, and acknowledged that it was mainly through his extravagance and impatience that Law had been induced to overstep the bounds of safe speculation. It was also ascertained that the national debt, on the 1st of January 1721, amounted to upwards of 100 millions of livres, or more than 124 million pounds sterling, the interest upon which was £3,196,000. A commission or visa was forthwith appointed to examine into all the securities of the state creditors, who were to be divided into 5 classes. The first 4 comprising those who had purchased their securities with real effects, and the latter comprising those who could give no proofs that the transactions they had entered into were real and bona fide. The securities of the latter were ordered to be destroyed, while those of the first 4 classes were subjected to a most rigid and jealous scrutiny. The result of the labours of the visa was a report in which they counselled the reduction of the interest upon these securities to 56 millions of livres. They justified this advice by a statement of the various acts of peculation and extortion which they had discovered, and an edict to the effect was accordingly published and duly registered by the parliaments of the kingdom. Another tribunal was afterwards established, which took cognizance of all the malversions committed in the financial departments of the government during the late unhappy period. A master of requests named Felonnet, together with Abbé Clement and 2 clerks in the employ, had been concerned in diverse acts of peculation to the amount of upwards of 1,000,000 of livres. The first 2 were sentenced to be beheaded, and the latter to be hanged, but their punishment was afterwards commuted into imprisonment for life in the Bastille. Numerous other acts of dishonesty were discovered, and punished by fine and imprisonment. D'Argenson shared with Law and the Regent the unpopularity which had alighted upon all those concerned in the Mississippi madness. He was dismissed from his post of Chancellor to make room for d'Aguesseau, but retained the title of Keeper of the Seals, and was allowed to attend the councils whenever he pleased. He thought it better, however, to withdraw from Paris, and live for a time a life of seclusion at his country seat. But he was not formed for retirement, and becoming moody and discontented, he aggravated a disease under which he had long laboured, and died in less than a 12-month. The populace of Paris so detested him that they carried their hatred even to his grave. As his funeral procession passed to the church of St. Nicholas, the burying place of his family, it was beset by a riotous mob, and his sons, who were following as chief mourners, were obliged to drive as fast as they were able down a by-street to escape personal violence. As regards Law, he for some time entertained a hope that he should be recalled to France, to aid in establishing his credit upon a firmer basis. The death of the regent in 1723, who expired suddenly, as he was sitting by the fireside conversing with his mistress, the Duchess de Pelery, deprived him of that hope, and he was reduced to his former life of gambling. He was more than once obliged to pawn his diamond, the sole remnant of his vast wealth, but successful play generally enabled him to redeem it. Being persecuted by his creditors at Rome, he proceeded to Copenhagen, where he received permission from the English ministry to reside in his native country, his pardon for the murder of Mr. Wilson having been sent over to him in 1719. He was brought over in the Admiral's ship, a circumstance which gave occasion for a short debate in the House of Lords. Earl Coningsby complained that a man who had renounced both his country and his religion should have been treated with such honour, and expressed his belief that his presence in England, at a time when the people were so bewildered by the nefarious practices of the South Sea directors, would be attended with no little danger. He gave notice of emotion on the subject, but it was allowed to drop, no other member of the House having the slightest participation in his lordship's fears. Law remained for about 4 years in England, and then proceeded to Venice, where he died in 1729, in very embarrassed circumstances. His brother William Law, who had been concerned with him in the administration both of the bank and the Louisiana Company, was imprisoned in the Bastille for alleged malversation, but no guilt was ever proved against him. He was liberated after 15 months and became the founder of a family, which is still known in France under the title of Marquis of Lauriston. In the next chapter will be found an account of the madness which infected the people of England at the same time, and under very similar circumstances, but which, thanks to the energies and good sense of a constitutional government, was attended with results far less disastrous than those which were seen in France. And with the end of that very long chapter, I'm going to call it there for tonight. If you'd like to pick up where we've left off or start going ahead, you can, as always, find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepytime Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night, and sweet dreams.